Thank you, Samriddhi. At the outset, I think the last session of the day, so there's always a lot of pressure, but I'm really glad. Personally, I can speak with some level of truthfulness that the previous sessions have really been fantastic. I really feel I have moved forward in terms of my learning, and thank you to everybody for that. That's been really good. As a born-again journalist, I thought I'll just quickly start with something, a personal viewpoint, which I don't hear about a lot when I meet people talk about the China versus India story. So here's the theory, okay? This is not very serious stuff, but I think you should hear me out on this since I'm on the stage. So I go to China a lot, simply because of the nature of what we do. China dominates the solar sector, and I end up going there quite regularly, not in the last 2 years, but yes, I was there about a month back. And after all these visits, interacting with a lot of people from there, I have to say that, there is this theory developing in my mind that there is one place where the Chinese are very, very different. And when it comes to the policies they have, what they do and how they do it, vis-a-vis India, for example. India, of course, English is our language of business. English is our language of power. And that makes us, I think, much, much more transparent, much, much more reactive in terms of what we do, in terms of where we take our lead from, as compared to what China does. What I found in China repeatedly was, and believe me, I've done we've kind of dealt with them very closely. Literally, it's like there are two worlds. There is a world of written in Chinese, which nobody knows about, because people who kind of really understand Chinese well, or who can really interact with the right people in China is very, very few right now. And there is a world which is written in English for people like us. And the world is very different. So while one extreme case might be that, even the financial reporting of a company might be very different from the English-speaking crowd as compared to the native audience. But what it's allowed them to do, I think, is really pretty much ignore what the rest of the world says or does and do it their way. And I say that because at the end of the day, China might be the world's #1 polluter. But the fact is, this whole green transition, all the climate crisis action points, they will not happen without, unfortunately or fortunately, China playing its role. We've seen that play out in solar, where India has repeatedly stumbled every time we have tried to do something about it. And I think we're going to see it in more and more areas, because especially for a developing country like ours, where efficiencies, everybody's spoken about today that nobody really does anything for climate unless there is some ROI in it, or unless there is some savings in it. And I think that's where we keep having to struggle. Anyway, so that was the theory. So maybe that's something, we'll take it up later. I would like to start with you, Professor Saxena, not Professor. You look like one, but yeah, sorry. We've spoken a lot about crisis today, and really, do we really believe there is a crisis? Do we really need a crisis to make things happen, or do you think there is some other way? Because coming back from that English perspective, I think we have the policies in place. We seem to be directionally on the right direction, going by what everybody said. But I don't think we are seeing enough progress, or are we?
See, policy, if we talk about in terms of the climate change, suddenly overnight ministry changed the name from Ministry of Environment and Forest to Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. So EV and all these are the very small sector where the policy is coming from the different ministries. As far as ministry is concerned, from the Environment Department, there is no policy on this thing. See, about 20 years back when we started the work called climate, we used to say manage unmanageable. Today time has changed, we can say manage manageable, because technology is available, CO2 sequestration is not a problem. But what industry is doing, we have about 20,000 pages on Google if you go about the Indian legislation, but we are lacking everywhere. 1974, the Air Act came into existence, Water Act, sorry. Gangas are polluted even today. Air Act is 81. So even if we have a policy tomorrow on climate change, it will not be so successful, I think, unless each and every corporate is coming forward. Net zero is going to be zero again in 2070 also. When we suddenly change from 2050 to 2070, maybe by 2060 we will say we will achieve net zero by 2090. So I think change is required from top to bottom in the corporates. Policies will not change the climate, or the policy will work for the climate management also.
Okay. So Raghav, since you represent, so to say, the corporate side of things, Do you believe corporates need that push in policy to move, or are they doing enough right now? Because there's a huge perception out there that there's a lot of greenwashing and the rest of it. Where do you think it's moving right now?
So I think there are multiple paths to this, right? So first of all, I don't think that corporates need any specific push to kind of achieve this. I think, corporates, multiple corporates, right? Whether you are an SME or you are a startup or you are a high-flying anchor corporate, right? Startups and MSMEs are struggling to ensure that they are on the sustainability track because anchor corporates have got large commitments. To ensure that they are not, cut off from the main value chains, they are struggling and they are kind of needing help, be it in terms of coaching, education, financing, funding, chaperoning, etc., to be a part of that anchor ecosystem. Anchor ecosystems have got pronounced commitments already and they are taking steps. We've seen so many anchor corporates in India across sectors where they have already started to implement, their race towards the net zero, be it in scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and we also kind of hear about scope 4, which is about decarbonizing non-manufacturing internet companies. This was not really, dependent on a particular policy to be kind of rolled out. I think sustainability, the whole definition and, the mindset to it is really kind of changing, where what we see, within HSBC, our broader ecosystems, etc., is that it's more of a shareholder commitment. It is more of a commitment to the communities that you serve. And, as I had also, I think, briefly mentioned in one of the other conversations, this is not really a start and a stop, right? I think policies are progressive. The attitude of corporates are, progressive. Is there being done enough? Probably maybe not. But are they probably on the right track, and are they, taking steps? The answer is yes. I'll just give you, I can speak for HSBC here. HSBC for scope 1 and scope 2, we are already 85% of our 2030 targets. We are completely water negative across, 90% of our sites, we are completely on, completely on, renewable energy. All our data centers here are, completely solar powered. So, whether it's paper reduction, whether it's water negativity, so on and so forth, scope 1 and scope 2 is obviously being addressed. I've also been informed and heard that, Tata's is the only company in India that has started, kind of reporting scope 3 emissions as well. So when you kind of talk about carbon accounting, which obviously brings you and gives you a great degree of insight, even if you're not one of those top 1,000 companies, which is, mandated by SEBI to kind of, disclose your carbon footprint, I think there is more than enough steps that a corporate is taking across, whether you're an anchor, whether you are a part of the ecosystem, to try and reduce their carbon footprint. And I think everybody is probably on that path. Some may be early, some may be slightly advanced. But I don't think essentially all of this is really determined on the policy itself. Yes, policy is going to give you that incentive, but that to me is more in terms of sector development. Right? And that we've already seen, even from an MNRE perspective or even from the government of India's perspective, you see multiple policies that have been announced at the same time, which is also instrumental in developing a very alternate energy, probably a very healthy mix of alternate energy. Who could ever think that ISTS, charges would be waived for the next 25 years? Who could ever think that the government has created a sovereign demand creation for every power company in India to produce 5% of its power kind of using biopellets. So, whether it's on green hydrogen, whether it's on offshore wind, onshore wind, solar panel localization, EVs, and, so on, I think the focus on creating alternate sources of energy is pretty much there. There are multiple policies that have been introduced. Are these policies, good enough? I think only time will tell, but at least, the base has been set up very well. And I can say this confidently because the shared optimism that we get from our international client base, from our client base, locally within the country, I don't think that this, level of optimism has been ever seen, whether it's in the VC community, private equity, community, or, pretty much the broader ecosystem that they want to invest in, is probably seen before. Yes, probably is there a ground to kind of improve, policies? For example, in green hydrogen, right? There's a great green hydrogen, policy announced. But then the focus of the government is now to ensure that there is bankability of projects. So there's always scope to kind of fine tune it. But I would probably just sum it up by saying that yes, the base has been set up. And I think every corporate today, I mean, irrespective of the size that you are in, irrespective of the part of the ecosystem that you kind of represent, are pretty much conscious just because of the fact that it's more of a shareholder plus a community, like commitment, like rather than, and it's not just kind of limited to just a scorecard objective.
Okay. Okay, great. Ankit, I'll come back to you now. Tell me, you are solving for a problem of intermittency, as I see it, that renewables produce power, a lot of that power risks being wasted. So you're probably going to store it and possibly supply it later. To look at just the solar sector, what we've seen is that between policy and execution, you had a direct conflict between DISCOMs and the ecosystem, so to say, because the DISCOMs are not ready for it. So for you, I'm assuming policy would be really important, or not. What do you say about that?
So broadly what I'm saying is that I think the policy framework required for doing this kind of a thing is already there in the Electricity Act, and what's essentially happening now is that the administrative framework is coming around this. So I think I'll just start like one quick example. I think in solar sector you also know that majority of the demand today is coming in from commercial and industrial sector. Why that is happening is because India's fundamental pricing is different for different load profiles. So a residential customer is subsidized, an agricultural customer is subsidized, but a commercial and industrial sector is paying the premium, essentially covering for the whole thing. So the way this entire thing was set up, it fundamentally meant that the moment government introduced accelerated depreciations and subsidies for owning up solar plants, a lot of corporates jumped up, and that is essentially what has created today's utility scale capacity in the country in solar sector. Today it makes a lot of sense to do production linked incentives also around it, and basically create that ecosystem where we can start producing panels, right? So I think broadly the policy framework for each and everything that is required to be done in climate tech or for its climate in general, I think it's more on the administrative side that requires a lot more work, and I think the only thing that can be done, sort of improved on, rest of the things are also already sort of laid out in the framework of the way initial policies came out. But I think broadly it's just that now policies around definite intent of closing this entire effort in a certain time frame, bringing a sense of urgency in the bureaucratic or administrative circles to get the execution out, is something that needs work. That's all.
Okay, Mr. Saxena, I'm going to come to you now. Raghav spoke about how a lot of corporates today are comfortable in terms of where they are on the journey to net zero or whatever the targets might be. Ankit just highlighted that because I think solar costs dropped much faster than anybody thought. A lot of companies have found it viable to take on more renewable energy, for example. Do you think there's a problem with that? And I'm saying that in the context of companies being comfortable. If you're talking about a crisis, shouldn't we see that being reflected in the way companies make an effort? And do you think something more needs to be done based on your experience?
See, I agree. What he suggested or mentioned about scope 1 and scope 2, for example, for HSBC, his experience is different. I am talking from the manufacturing industry. We cannot compare HSBC with cement industry or NTPC. Whole pollution is different. You cannot, and there was a time when you can enter into a cement plant with a blue jacket and you will come grey. Today time has changed, this stack is clean. When we talk of climate change and crisis, yes, solar everybody is moving, as you mentioned, the 5%. Now everybody, but what I'm saying, sustainability reporting is nothing. Scope 1, scope 2 is a very small case for you. But scope 1, scope 2 is nothing for a cement industry, for example. Our main concern in cement or NTPC is the CO2 emission which we are doing from the stack, or SPM emission which is going to 10-15 kilometers depending upon the wind direction and the wind speed. So problems are totally different. Things are moving in the right direction. But what is happening, the sustainable development, this morning Minister mentioned that we are thinking that the country will take industrial development as well as environment hand in hand. This was a sentence by Kamal Nath also in 1994 also, for example. But if you take any consent or any clearance from the Ministry of Environment for any industry today, you will see that there is nothing about the climate change what the industry should do. When ministry is saying that you must go for your emission control below 50, why power industry is criticizing that we cannot take below 50 microgram normal meter cube? Time has come now, sustainability people, CSO, IT industry, for example, that's a clean industry. It's as good as a hotel industry. The main problem is that we discuss environment and climate change with so many lights on. And we don't know what is waste minimization at source, for example. If we switch off these lights, we will save some CO2 emission, which is climate control. So industry is doing all these things. But now time has come that CSO should take the lead and they should have a courage to go to the managing director or CEO and inform that we have to write our strategy totally different today. Why power industry has to go along with countries net zero by 2070? I think power industry should say that every 5 years we will go 10% reduction in our thermal power production. This is not happening. And this will not happen with the legislation also. This has to come in between. We need some, you people are investors here. I don't know how to invest money in my own also, which I got a little bit after retirement. But time has come now, investors or company secretary or MD should say that this year we are giving only 10% dividend to our stakeholders or shareholders, and rest 10% we would like to give it to you. It will go for our green innovation industries product also. Not even a single corporate is saying it. When I am talking about corporate, I am talking about manufacturing like Tata, Birla, or you take another case of pharma industry, for example. Each and every European country is buying pharmaceutical from India. There's a new term today, we say antibiotics in the environment. I will not name the industry. First thing is I'm no more with you. This was in 1617. Please remove that also. So antibiotics in the environment, each and every pharma industry, medium and small and large, are disposing their effluent in the backside of the industry, rear end. They are in remote areas. A time will come that villagers within the 5-kilometer area, maybe tomorrow when they are down with some fever or something, antibiotic will not help him. And our government is not worried. So this is what I am saying. We have legislation, but it is not helping. Tomorrow, legislation on climate change or crisis will not help at all. We have to have our own vision to change the world, and we are not changing. And when I'm saying we, I'm talking about the people who have money. One is sitting right in front of me. They must put the pressure on the manufacturing facility that you must go for a new technology today. No more CO2 emission tomorrow. That is what they should say. Then only I will give you money. Thank you.
So Raghav, this is for you. We saw a mandate for investing CSR funds for companies above a certain profit level. They all had to do it. Frankly, after all these years, I don't think that's made a significant impact. Do you see that changing in some way to ensure something is done on the climate side? Is that what it would take, or have we learned some lessons from there?
So I think CSR funding also over the last few years have undergone a change, right? And I can speak again from an HSBC perspective. Our whole global, philanthropy strategy has undergone a review, where and obviously there is like some sort of a difference, right? Because we happen to be a branch, and hence we have to operate in a very restricted, template manner. And there was a question that was raised in the earlier panel as well, that how can you channel more grant funding? Right, so fortunately, unfortunately for us, we can only invest into a Section 8 company, or largely kind of route those funds to an NGO. But having said that, at least I think with the clients, I think the set of clients that we kind of operate, and that's pretty much across the ecosystem, not only the blue chip companies in India, and including from an HSBC sales perspective as well. The grant funding focus is also now becoming quite a sectoral. So for example, in India, we've set up a $250 million fund. Plus we've set aside 250 crores out of our CSR funding. And just to give you some real life examples, right? There has been, there's been investment through Shakti Foundation in west of India to be to be running an accelerator program that will only be investing into green hydrogen startups. There is this whole Life for Skills program that we've run from 2014, and which is now into the second phase, where we've educated about 10 lakh youth. When we develop transition plans for our clients, and as a result of transitioning from brown and gray into green, from brown and gray into green, if there is an expectation or if there's a forecast that people will end up losing jobs, then we'll try and coach them and kind of club them under our Life for Skills program. Similarly, in terms of mangrove restoration, wetlands, farmer education, this whole support around, this whole support around the women hygiene, gender equality, etc. So these are key pillars, not only from not only for HSBC CSR, strategy, but I think these are like common pillars. So when you kind of take an understanding, when you kind of take a view of the UN SDGs, CSR policies today are, I think, pretty much based on trying to trying to kind of support, probably like one or a few of those UN SDGs. And, some of the common ones are, like women equality, but gender equality, women empowerment, this whole life for skills program, this whole piece around, the water restoration, land reservation, and so on and so forth. I think a large part of the CSR funding, at least from our perspective, is trying to now get into channels of supporting new tech, so which includes e-mobility or maybe any of these techs that are driving a decarbonization. So CSR funding is obviously there. I think there was a question that one of the, I think probably you had raised about blended finance. So blended finance is again coming out to be an effective instrument where banks, financial institutions, they do kind of collaborate with, say, a few of these multilateral institutions. You've got SIDBI, World Bank, EIB, and so on and so forth. While it has its own challenges, but then that's also onto a positive trajectory in terms of coming out with structures that ultimately help to reduce the bankability gap. The funding is not a challenge to anchor corporates. Funding is not a challenge for a Series C or a Series D, say probably a startup. But then the focus is how do you support a bootstrap startup? How do you kind of support someone who's at a seed stage? Ultimately to give wings to that project. So the answer to your question is yes. And coming back to you, so it's a mix of grant funding, which is obviously CSR policies are being revisited. They are sectoral allocations, and then a whole swathe of other financial instruments where the banks tend to be focused on just one unilateral objective of how do you try and reduce the bankability gap with a view how do you give wings to some of these early stage projects.
Ankit, as an entrepreneur, I know you have to be optimistic. You have to be looking ahead. Considering all we heard in terms of the improved funding environment for climate ventures like yours, do you buy into the idea of rapid growth if enough money was available? Or do you believe the market is simply not ready for it? There is too much to do. Or you could just end up burning a lot of money like we saw many sectors do earlier?
See, I think it's this whole idea of do I believe in rapid growth or not? I think the problem that we are dealing with is something that is, there's an instantaneous cost benefit in it. We are fundamentally displacing coal and oil, right? There's a clear incentive for everyone. So I think it's a supply side model. The core idea that we are fundamentally at Sheru also doing is around building an operating system through which this displacement can happen. Right now, there is already an intent in all the stakeholders. There's already a cost benefit. And there's already a optical benefit also to the right people, right? So I think with capital, of course, there's a requirement of having the right support system so that execution is not stuck into confusions between departments or unclear administrative regulation. I would not say regulations also, administrative frameworks, right? Wherever the handshaking is not clear. I think those things will definitely are something which capital cannot overthrow. Those things take their own time. That's more about building a stakeholder buy-in. But the problem that we are dealing in climate tech, whether it is, and I'm just talking about electrification, right? Electrification is, 60-70% of the climate tech problem. So I think, so it solves that 60-70%. I think it's fairly clear that the intent, unit economics, everything is out there. All that has to be done is that maybe right handshaking has to be done. And just to reiterate again, capital can, of course, move a lot. The moment those checkpoints are sort of cleared up and stakeholder buy-ins are there. And I think there, a lot of question is around whether it is sustainable, right? In the people who have to give a buy-in on adopting new systems, they have to look at it from a long-term vision point of view. They have to look at it from 20 years, 50 years. So there's a requirement of having that kind of vision, that what kind of system will come into place in the next 20 years, what's the steady state going to look like, and how according to that we have to structure everything, what kind of handshaking has to be done. That whole exercise has to be done. And that is something that can, of course, be expedited with more, I would say, signaling in the market that, hey, I am here to stay. I'm going to solve this problem for you. I empathize with your situation. It's going to take a while, but we are here to stay. So I think that definitely capital can add as a lot of value to startups.
But since you're solving the problem of electrification, as you
Yeah.
storing that
Yeah.
energy for later, in that context, do you think the hype about green hydrogen makes sense, or should we be spending that money in renewable energy, which is an established model?
So basically, I think hydrogen has its relevance. I don't understand the green or blue hydrogen aspect of it. I think hydrogen fundamentally has lower energy efficiency. That is something that doesn't make sense in electric systems, that doesn't make sense into mobility systems, but it has a lot of value in steel and cement, right? So there it makes sense. But I think climate tech there are two parts about climate tech. One is the way we interact with natural resources, that is changing. And second, there is this entire oxymoron of responsible consumerism, right? I mean, experiencing growth, how do you balance that whole thing out? So I think it's a systemic change. Spray and pray delays things. Spray and pray makes a lot of sense on demand side markets. There, you just spray over the entire, all the possibilities. You just spray everything over all the possibilities, and whichever has the highest demand, it sort of stands out. But when it's a supply side change, it's a systemic change, you can't, the moment you spray, you are essentially confusing the entire market that this can also work out, this can also work out, this can work out everywhere, this can work out everywhere. I think, so what is happening? What is truly happening when we're saying climate change is there? What is truly happening when we say that climate tech is required? Right? That needs to be assimilated. Right? We cannot be rash about spending this money. You yourself saw solar sector taking responsible decisions at the right time. It's not like the subsidies were not curbed. But right now, instead of localization, adoption is most important in India. Once we have enough resources, once we have enough demand, localization will automatically happen. It's the kind of technology, we are dealing with a kind of technology which there is a potential of connected supply chains. You can recycle a lot of value. It's been proven out everywhere. Right? Our country is known to do JVs. That can happen later on also. So localization can happen, but not at the cost of adoption. Right? So I think it's a supply side change. It has to be thought with a little more patience than just saying that let's fund each and every crazy idea out there with a belief that it might work.
Sure. See, I think since this is more on climate policy crisis, right? We've obviously spoken everything which is good and everything which is in progression. Just taking a step back, and I'll just take a minute to conclude here. The main problem statement when we are talking, I mean, it's, there are great ideas, there are great projects, there is great private equity coming in, there is great equity funding coming in, etc. But anything which is to do with renewable energy, right? Until unless it is under the as service, sort of category, that is going to be capex heavy. And for your valuations to be seeking a decent amount of momentum, it needs to be appropriately leveraged, right? So just taking a step back, we've done a deep analysis. It's been submitted to the PMO as well. The average funding that is needed per year to be just, and maybe Nipun, you would kind of reckon with this, the average funding that is needed per year only for India to meet its RE obligations is $175 billion per annum. This is the amount of actual funding over and above the equity money that has already come in for India to achieve its 440 gigawatts of renewable energy target. Just a quick raise of hand, any idea of what the actual average funding in India today is, if we take the average of the last 3 years? The mere average is at just $20 billion by all banks put together, right? Which is not even 2% of the actual funding that needs to go for India to fund its transition plan. I can always stand up and say and feel the most happiest that today HSBC does 20% of the total green funding that's available in India, right? But then the fact of the matter is that it's really a cumulative effort. I think the equity is doing its play, the policy makers are doing their play. It's time for funding to go up, and that's to the main theme that this is a policy crisis. or maybe the major stumbling block that needs to be cleared out. And there are various advocacies that we are doing in this regard through forums such as IBA, Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, and so on and so forth, where we are trying to develop a catalytic financing models as a group of banks, which is a mix of foreign banks, PSU banks, including SBI, HDFCs, and Kotaks of the world, with obviously leading players from the industry represented across the ecosystem of what is needed to fund the anchor project, what is needed to fund the ecosystem, what is needed to fund the supply chain. And mind you, it's not only the funding. When you're funding it, it also needs to be sustainable funding. So I may stand up and say that I have a great, I have a great incentive model of funding. You may be a supplier to a large OEM, probably on the manufacturing side. I will probably not even look at your balance sheet and just do a purchase out, probably a purchase order funding, and probably at the same rate at which I would have extended to the anchor corporate. But the fact is that if all banks are taking this step, including us, the average over the last 3 years probably should have gone up, right? The average has still not gone up. The average funding in India for the last 3 years has still been hovering around $21 billion. So that major funding gap, I was in a conversation with RBI, and like they said that is this really credit starved? We've been advocating to grant PSL status, to everything that's green. RBI kind of comes back with this view that is this, credit starved? I said the gap of $150 billion, if this is not credit starvedness, then what is being credit starved, right? So, the reason, and, like once again from an HSBC perspective, I would probably just say we are not too fussed about the energy mix. We've also heard, I think in the previous panel where they've made a comment that if a VC fund or if an investor is unable to price the tech risk, I think it's difficult for banks to come and price the tech risk. And I think that's where these blended finance models play beautifully well. They do take time. I was just speaking to someone just before the start of the session. The average time that an MLI takes to assess a project is between 8 to 12 months and maybe slightly higher, right? And probably they rightly do so because it is all sovereign funding. It is it is probably the money of taxpayers, etc. But when you really talk about reducing this funding gap, which is kind of addressing this major policy crisis, because finance is the core and center of really kind of enabling the transition. I think at the end of the day, it has to be a mix of your own balance sheet appetite. It has to be a mix of blended finance. It has to be, with the central government and state governments really stepping up. I was very pleased to see that the Indian Banking Association has made a recommendation to MNRE to introduce sovereign guarantees, to try and bring in parity for the developer and parity for the financier, right? This whole piece around viability, gap funding for offshore wind. Why would an offshore wind developer today, invest $1 billion, in setting up a 1 gigawatt plant, when you have onshore at 2.71 and you've got offshore at 9 rupees per unit. So this viability gap funding, bringing it at 5 rupees, and I think there's already been a consensus there. So I think, just to kind of, conclude, financing or maybe developing, catalytic, financing models is one area from a policy perspective, I think, which you're working on. I'll be happy to share that paper with you, Sailesh, that's gone to the PMO and also to the Finance Ministry. It's a very serious piece of advocacy which has been going on for the last 24 months. I think this is one key pillar. And then the other pieces around whether it's CSR funding or whether it's introducing newer concepts like environmental-based funding, where every corporate out of its profit allocates a part to CSR plus environmental responsive lending is, something is a fairly new concept within the B20 tracks that we are a part of. So I think it really has to be a combination of all of this to plug this financing issue.
I think I'll probably disagree a little bit there because quite simply, based on your own numbers, we're taking a knife to a battle where we need probably guns. And that's, I think the Indian government will probably also say that, and we've been saying it at various forums, that the share of non-commercial funding has simply not materialized when it comes to the developing world, from the developed world. And that's been a primary reason. And unless that happens, I'm guessing it's not really a crisis for anybody. Mr. Saxena, just one last question for you. We've seen in India the whole change in mindsets, or whatever you want to call it, when it comes to the corporate world has been driven by, for example, the World Bank initially said we must have an ESG report on your project. That's where it started off. People learned to make some sort of a report. Then now, of course, you have the whole ESG environment subsystem, which is driving change. You have green financing and green bonds, all of that. All of that happened where it happened, let's say in the West, because at a community level, there was a lot of awareness, there was the drive for change. In India, we're simply doing it because somebody is telling us to do it. There are institutions telling us, you will not do, if you don't do this, you won't get it. Do you agree with that? Do you think we can really make a difference with that approach? Or are we missing out something on the communication side at a ground level?
I just take 2 minutes. Early 90s, ISO 9000, ISO 14001 started. And industry took it in 2 days' time. BIS, which was earlier Indian Institute of Specification, they used to do it. We were moving very fast in this direction wherever we feel there is a name, for example. Today, if you see sustainability report of, for example, ITC, you will feel as if you are reading a Femina magazine. Suddenly, in last 2 years, sustainability report has changed to ESG. The water which you are drinking today says responsible water. It says cane is more responsible than plastic bottle. I will not agree. So this is what is happening to environment in Indian corporate. His corporate is different. I'm sorry. I'm not criticizing the corporates. But what I'm saying is manufacturing facilities, for example, if you see a CSR, is different. If you just come out of an NTPC plant, out of any Ambuja plant, out of any Tata electricity plant, why the conditions at the 500 meter are different? Roads are dirty, sewage water is on the road, schools are not there, transportation is not there, everybody is spending 2% of the money on CSR, then where this money is going? Last 3 years, everybody was distributing sanitizer because it is just evaporating, money just evaporated. So I'm not criticizing. I'm saying the visibility of sustainability is changing to ESG. But those who are writing ESG have no idea what is E for and what is S for and what is G for. The corporate communication expert are the sustainability officers. So what will happen? Today, if you have no job, for example, as he mentioned, that IT just suggested you go and take a CSO job and he become a CSO. If that is going to, I'm not criticizing Mahindra also. I'm just saying this is happening in industry. When I resigned from Tata Power in 2015, the corporate communication took over as CSO. The new MD realized that no, she is not doing anything, so she was kicked out. Now Tata Power, such a good group, you are saying Tata Trust and all that, and Tata Power is without a CSO. So what will happen? When I joined 2012 Tata Power, there was no thing like EHS which is important. We initiated biodiversity. Sorry to say, if you see our report of Tata Power 2013, 14, 15 when I was there, even I wrote on IG targets also which people are not aware. How many of we know that what is eco mark of this country? Any idea, please? 1,000 rupees I will give from my pocket if you know what is eco mark. Eco mark is earthen pot, जिसको हिंदी में घड़ा बोलते हैं. Not even a single product of eco mark is available on the Indian shelf if you go to like Big Bazaar or Reliance or anywhere. And Ministry introduced this in association with CPCB and FICCI in 1994. And afterwards, there's another notification came, the banning of the fly ash bricks. So I suggested there is no need of this ghada as eco mark. It's better you go for a water hyacinth flower, which is blue lily, as eco mark because that is biodegradable. But minister also has no vision. They will not listen to people like you and me also. Another example I will give you where the industries are lacking. They are the clean, hotel, bank, they are the clean industry basically, real estate for example. When the notification on fly ash use came into existence, cement industry, I was with Ambuja, we used to say to the government, no sir, it's very difficult to use fly ash because loading, unloading and transportation cost was high and fly ash quality was not good. When good quality fly ash was available at the thermal power station and you can take your own tankers, we started using fly ash and then we say pozzolana cement is better than OPC. But now time has come, cement industry should come forward and say that we will not produce OPC. That time is required basically for climate change also, for ESG also. So this water is not responsible, sorry for that.
Ankit, one last question for you. You know, we heard Blue Smart talking about how it's actually primarily a charging company also for the future. From your perspective, do you see all these firms as future energy storage firms? Is that a possibility?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a very fundamental correlation in mobility and energy storage. Simply because as a society, either we are consuming energy on road, largely together,
right,
or we are consuming it in buildings. So I think actually there is a lot of potential to utilize the assets that are coming in the form of electric vehicles. for grid load balancing, for managing this intraday energy storage complexity that is coming with renewables. Of course, that's the problem that it will solve, but for itself, in being in a growth phase, it has a lot of potential to increase its growth rate, to give that conviction to the people who are investing in these assets, or they're building that out, that there's significant layer of protection from of revenues from multiple streams. So it's EVs largely have been looked at as a liability for in-grid context, right? EVs have been looked at as something that can probably add, let's say, 10% of the demand in the next 8-10 years and requires 25 to 30% infrastructure upgrade. I think just by adding this functionality, you are saying that EVs are not a liability, EVs are an asset for the grid.
Sure.
So I think that's of course, I mean.
Great. So I hope Puneet is around. He's got his next growth driver, and he remembers you for that. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time.
Can I just take 1 second?
Yeah.
Please finish your water. This is responsibility.
Yeah, it's already tough. Please don't waste it.